Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Soo Kim. The U.S. Office of Director of National Intelligence assessed that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un may be considering whether to resume long-range missile or nuclear testing this year to try to force the United States to deal with him on Pyongyang's terms. Meanwhile, a bipartisan caucus of the U.S. House of Representatives, the Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission, held a hearing on freedom of expression on the Korean Peninsula, expressing concerns over South Korea's ban on sending of anti-Pyongyang leaflets into North Korea. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Soo Kim. Ms. Kim is policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and adjunct instructor at American University. She served as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency and also worked at the Department of Homeland Security. Scott Snyder also joins me today. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Young.
The report from the Office of Director of National Intelligence said North Korea may resume nuclear and ICBM testing this year. Ms. Kim, do you actually see there is the possibility?
So I think there's always been a possibility, and the latest threat assessment is not really much of a surprise or anything new. We've seen indications. We've also seen in the recent couple years that North Korea had imposed a moratorium on ICBM testing as well as nuclear testing. But the regime recently came out and said that this moratorium was going to be pretty much jettisoned. We've also seen, of course, the constant references to North Korea not wanting to really come to talks or to negotiate with the United States unless the United States gets rid of its hostile policy. So there's always been pretext and there's always been a justification. So what we're seeing in the latest assessment is not really anything that is completely shocking to us.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, as Ms. Kim said, this isn't something new, is it?
No, I agree with what Sue had to say. It really anticipates provocation and it kind of downplays the possibility of negotiations. And so that's very interesting, especially as we think about how this assessment might frame the outcome of the North Korea policy review.
Mm-hmm. Still, the same report noted North Korea has left the door open for denuclearization talks. If Kim is really open to the talks, why didn't he respond when the Biden administration reached out earlier in February, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that there's a contradiction there that is highlighted in the assessment, and it's really the contradiction between the North Korean Kim Jong-un's leaving the door open for talks and the fact that the North Koreans really want talks that are not focused on denuclearization. And so that contradiction is there. It's a square that remains to be circled, and it's probably an indicator that we're headed for stalemate more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. President Joe Biden indicated that diplomacy with North Korea is open, but only when denuclearization is the goal. Ms. Kim, does it mean the talks are not likely to happen if North Korea doesn't show clearly its intentions to denuclearize?
So I think when we had the new Biden administration come into office, it was pretty clear that summits just for the sake of summitry was going to be out of the question. I also think that for looking at it from Kim Jong-un's perspective or his perch, he doesn't quite exactly have the United States where he wants it. He understands that he's dealing with a new administration, one that is much different in culture and I think in terms of objectives from the previous administration. So he understands that if he were to accept this offer for talks at this moment, doesn't really have the United States where he wants it. So the latest pronouncements by the North Korean officials, berating the United States, criticizing South Korea is a way for Pyongyang to place the pressure on Washington and to clearly communicate to potential interlocutors that North Korea is not really going to be moving that much from its original goalpost.
All right. According to the report, Kim Jong-un probably does not view the current level of pressure on his regime as enough to require a fundamental change in its approach. Does this suggest that the U.S. can put more pressure, Ms. Kim?
When we're talking about pressure, we have to, I think, be mindful of just how much pressure, of course, we're putting on the North Korean regime, but also in what ways. So it's not just pressure for the sake of applying pressure blindly, but it has to be in conjunction with some of the other policy measures that we're considering, not just concentrated on the nuclear and the missile matter, but of course, as you've seen just this week, the North Korean human rights issue is also going to be something very important to not just the United States, but in terms of sending a clear message to North Korea as well as to the rest of the world that engagement with the United States on sensitive matters like the nuclear issue is going to be pursued from a holistic perspective.
Mr. Snyder, is there any way the U.S. can put more pressure on North Korea? For example, more sanctions?
Well, more than more sanctions, perhaps a more precise application of some of the available measures, for instance, that are already authorized in the context of past congressional efforts. But I think the real dilemma that we face is that we can apply more pressure, but the North Korean regime has indicated that pressure is exactly what it's going to resist most. And so I agree that it's going to have to be pressure in combination with some other measures, and that simply trying to measure the aggregate amount of pressure is probably not going to yield the desired result.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the U.S. Congress held a rare hearing discussing South Korea's ban on anti-Pyongyang leaflets. What witnesses said there were in line with what many watchers have expected, but even the members of the Congress bluntly criticized the moves taken by the South Korean government. Mr. Snyder, was this something you expected?
Yeah, it's not surprising that the U.S. Congress would have a bipartisan view towards a restriction on freedom of speech in South Korea. It simply makes sense from an external perspective to expect that a fellow democracy that is leading in so many areas in terms of democratic expression would not take measures that restrict freedom of expression. And so I know that it may look differently from inside in the context of South Korean politics, but from an external perspective, it's quite striking as a retrogressive measure that is not in line with the broader anticipated ideals and values of a like-minded democracy.
Ms. Kim, what was your main takeaway from the hearing?
The anti-leaflet ban is not just about the leaflets per se. And I think what the United States is trying to get at is not just the fact that we are banning the physical deployment or the dropping of leaflets and other materials about South Korea and the outside world to the North Koreans, but it's actually getting at, of course, where alliance values should be aligned. For instance, of course, the basic freedoms and liberties of individuals and the free access to information. This is really critical, I think, in terms of not just in sending information and opening the eyes of the North Korean population, but this is a way also to weaken the pressure that Kim Jong-un is putting on South Korea. To say that the leaflets, sending them to North Korea is going to be a provocation, or that it's going to be getting in the way of inter-Korean reconciliation, I think that will actually embolden Kim Jong-un even more, because the criticisms and the realities of the North Korean regime, that pressure button is just going to be gone. And that in turn, I think, is going to allow Kim Jong-un even more to exert pressure through the nuclear and the missile provocations, but also by abusing the rights of his citizens. So that was, I think, that the biggest takeaway for me. And I think that For the United States to come out and say this at this point in the earlier stages of the Biden administration, it's also trying to set the tone, not just with respect to the North Korea matter, but in terms of where the United States is going to be aligned and the messaging to the region, and also in terms of its broader strategic objectives vis-a-vis China and other security and human rights issues that we're dealing with right now.
There were some voices opposing the hearing itself. Some called it an interference in South Korea's internal affairs. The hearing still took place despite such opposition. Mr. Snyder, is this because these members of the Congress took very seriously what is currently happening in South Korea in terms of the North Korean human rights?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that they're taking it seriously, but I think that there's also some perplexity with regards to this particular law, precisely because historically for the U.S. Congress, in the battle between democracy and authoritarianism, information warfare has been a key component. And that means being able to actively try to provide information to individuals in regimes that exercise a monopoly of information. And so I think that what was really perplexing for congressmen is the idea that in democratic South Korea, there would be a desire to possibly protect the North Korean regime from that information, and even a sense of obeisance to North Korean desires, because information warfare has been going on. It's going to continue, but the idea that an outside group would accept the diktat of the authoritarian that is trying to control information flow internally, I think it was just baffling for the congressman.
During the hearings, some congressmen urged that South Korea's National Assembly fix the law banning anti-North Korean leaflets, and the U.S. State Department told VOA that South Korea is a democracy with an independent and strong judiciary and has tools in place to allow for review of the law. Mr. Snyder, what do you make of this?
I think the congressman and maybe even some people in the State Department believe that the law is a misstep, and they're essentially suggesting a face-saving way out for the South Korean government, either through a direct legal redress or through a judicial review.
Ms. Kim, how do you see this? Are both the U.S. legislative and executive branches expecting the South Korean government to act on this?
It's a way for the United States to gently nudge or perhaps more directly to sort of try to pressure the South Korean government and to remind the South Korean government that it's a liberal democracy and that as an ally, it also has not just the prerogative, but also the responsibility to safeguard these rights and liberties, not just for its citizens, but in view of the broader context of inter-Korean reconciliation and ultimate reunification, the basic necessities to laying the pathway for unification under a democracy, this is a prerequisite. So there was a message not just to the North Koreans, but I think also to the South Korean government.
Going forward, do you think this issue might affect the U.S.-South Korea alliance, Ms. Kim?
Hopefully, this is not going to deter the two sides from, working on and cooperating on other issues that are important to them. For instance, of course, the China issue is going to figure importantly for the United States, but also for South Korea. If South Korea is also intent on supporting the United States' efforts in the region, considering joining the Quad, and also considering how its new Southern policy is actually going to be melding and integrating with the United States' efforts in the region as well. So hopefully what this is going to do is to not create further divisions between the two countries, but actually to reorient Seoul and Washington back together so that they're actually back on the path that they were prior to, I would say, the past few years.
What about you, Mr. Snyder? Will this have any negative impact on the alliance?
Well, yeah, it has a negative impact to the extent that it is another issue of difference that has to be managed. But I think we also have to look at it more deeply than that, because the Biden administration, as Sue has suggested, is really trying to draw a sharp line between democracy and authoritarianism. And these kinds of potential differences on issues of values and interests can, over time, be corrosive to our alliance cooperation. And so I don't think that this particular issue represents an immediate threat to the alliance, but I think that over time it will serve to weaken the basis for the alliance, and in fact, it might even bring some to conclude that South Korea is kind of a weak link as we think about broader building of alliance values-based coalitions in the context of the broader environment.
President Biden just had his first face-to-face summit with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and President Biden will meet South Korean President Moon Jae-in for the first time next month in Washington, D.C. Mr. Snyder, what are the topics that need to be discussed most urgently?
I think that what we saw from the successive 2+2 meetings and the first cabinet level interaction of the Biden administration with the governments of Japan and South Korea is that the agendas for both countries are very much parallel. And so we're getting a kind of preview of the main issues for discussion between Biden and Moon in the readouts from the Biden-Suga meetings. And essentially what that means is that there's going to be a broad focus on more effective coordination in order to meet a variety of challenges related to China, alongside the needs to coordinate policy on the objective of denuclearization of North Korea. And I might just add on that there's been some controversy about denuclearization of North Korea versus denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I would say that as long as we're not negotiating with North Korea, then denuclearization of North Korea is definitely the appropriate phrase. Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula has been used in the context of negotiated outcomes with North Korea. But I would say that as long as there are no negotiations, then denuclearization of North Korea really puts the right point on what our objectives are.
Interesting point. Ms. Kim, what's your thought on this, about the term denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula versus denuclearization of North Korea?
I think we absolutely should place importance on the terminology. I know that there's been some debate about what the semantics are behind it and whether or not we're putting too much emphasis on just wording, but we have to understand that when dealing with North Korea, you have to ensure that you're not leaving any gaps or vulnerabilities where the regime or its negotiators are going to be coming back and saying, well, this is not how things were delineated or how things were defined. The terminology of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, that's actually, of course, as we know, it's not just focused on the threat in North Korea, but of course eliminating potential security threats from the perspective of the regime in South Korea as well. Imagine what that means for the United States-South Korea alliance, the posturing of U.S. troops on the peninsula and perhaps even in Japan. So this has broader implications beyond just the nuclear issue. We're talking about alliance matters and perhaps even the geopolitical positioning of the United States in the region, and with respect to, if you were to broaden the scope, with respect to China as well. So again, this is not just a bilateral issue. This is not just a North Korean nuclear issue, but where we start in defining the scope of denuclearization, I think, is going to set us on the path for other decisions that are going to be affected by this. So I do agree with Scott in that when we are negotiating with North Koreans, we have to make it clear that it's the denuclearization of North Korea as opposed to the Korean Peninsula.
Well, both the United States government and legislature spoke out in unison, raising concerns over South Korea's ban on anti-North Korean leaflets. U.S. Representative Chris Smith, who co-chaired the recent hearing, emphasized human rights issues are universal principles binding upon every one of us. We'll have to watch how the two allies, U.S. and South Korea, will iron out their differences in this issue. Ms. Kim and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.